Yeah, go on then. Total War. Total War. Total War. You know, when you stop and think about it, that name is a little bit grim, isn't it? Calls to mind the First and Second World Wars, people crying in trenches, getting limbs blown off, all sorts of grim shit like that. It's always made it a bit of an odd name, to my mind, given that it's a series that's kind of preoccupied with the pre-World War I idea of honourable and glorious warfare. What's also odd to me is just how popular the series has been over much of its lifetime. It's a strange mixture of gameplay styles. One half of it, the one most people recall best, is a real-time historical battle simulator, essentially, though the levels of historical accuracy in any given game vary wildly. There are no resources to gain or exploit, no bases to build, and unless you're in a siege battle, no defences to hide behind or overcome. No, it's you, your guys, a field, the enemy, and that's it. If you didn't bring enough soldiers, well, you're just dead. If you brought enough soldiers, but they're the wrong kind of soldier, yep, still dead. But at the same time, if you play smart enough, you can turn an enemy army that outnumbers your own into a fleeing pack of weeping children. A pretty in-depth simulation of the ancient world's military engagements it is, in which the tactics of that same ancient world do actually play out fairly accurately. Sounds fun, and it is. But it doesn't exactly sound like the kind of thing that would draw the attention of the mainstream crowd. Rather, it sounds like the kind of thing that would draw in a not inconsiderable, but still niche audience. Then you have the other half of the games, the grand campaign maps, which resemble nothing so much as a simplified down grand strategy game, a dumbed down version of the intimidating complexity beasts that Paradox Interactive is best known for developing and publishing. This being another form of game that appeals to another niche audience of, again, not inconsiderable size, but not exactly the biggest audience in the world, hardly the mainstream. Someone could be forgiven for thinking that the combination of these two disparate elements into one game wouldn't leave you with a particularly popular franchise. Somehow, someone would be incorrect for thinking that, however. The Total War series is a consistently popular and successful franchise, though it is one that can only exist because of how weird the PC gaming market is, currently and historically. It's full of nerds, my friends. It's full of nerds. As you may have figured out by this point, I'm going to be talking about a Total War game today, but it's not going to be one of the ones you might expect if you didn't read the full title of the video. I've sunk more time into Total War Medieval 2 than I like to admit, but that's not the one I'll be chatting about. The same can be said of Shogun 2, which was my entry into the series, as I recall, and a game that has a special place in my tiny, black, empty, fat-clad heart. I'm not going to be talking about Rome 2, though that's largely because I've barely played it. Though, saying that does mean that I consider 24 hours of game time to be barely playing it. No, today I'm going to be talking about the Total War game I've spent the most time with. The Total War game I've enjoyed the most. A Total War game that can be considered something of a black sheep made of money. It's been surrounded by controversy within the Total War community since its announcement. It's also one of, if not the most successful Total War game ever released. I'll stop dilly-dallying and actually tell you the name of the bloody thing now, shall I? Today, I'm talking about the first Total War game, to my knowledge, to completely divorce itself from real-world history. Indeed, my favourite game ever. Today, I'm talking about Total War Warhammer. Let me tell you something, friends. People had, and indeed still have, no idea what to think about Total War Warhammer, collectively. Released in 2016 amid a flurry of rumours and theories and complaints, and following Total War Rome 2 and Total War Attila, a pair of big releases for developers Creative Assembly, which had some astonishingly rocky launches, but some decent post-release recoveries, Total War Warhammer found itself in an awkward position right from the start. It seemed that its mere existence ripped the Total War fandom in twain. Half of them seemed to be enraptured by the idea of getting to play with some absurd fantastical elements in their Total War game, this being the half that presumably led to the success of the Call of Warhammer mod for Total War Medieval 2 and the Small Armada of Lord of the Rings mods that have followed the franchise for years. The other half hated the idea of a fantasy Total War, being understandably pretty bloody invested in the whole portrayal of history thing, and hoping for a new historically based Total War after the number of retreads of already explored time periods in Shogun 2, Rome 2, and Attila. Good games all, but not breaking new ground so far as the setting was concerned. Not too long after its announcement, while the fanbase was still reeling from the game's mere existence, something else happened that would dog the game for, essentially, its entire life cycle. Pre-order DLC was announced. Now, this is nothing new as far as video games go, obviously, and isn't exactly new for Total War itself. Rome 2 had the Greek States pack, locking off a handful of Greek factions unless you pre-ordered or bought the DLC after the fact. Shogun 2 did as well, though I can't quite find exactly what its pre-order bonus was. Either the DLC Hattori clan or a historical battle, it seems to be, depending on where you bought it from. Even Attila did it, locking 3 playable factions behind a paywall if you didn't pre-order. The Chaos Warriors pack, by contrast, doesn't seem that bad on a surface level. Yes, pre-order DLC still sucks, by default, and no one is happy when something that's already been finished and is intended to be in the base game is locked off behind a wall to force you to pre-order or pony up some more cash post-release. But it doesn't sound too bad. It's only one faction locked away, after all, after the historical establishment of 3 factions being locked away in previous games. Despite this, there was a quite aggressive fan backlash against the Chaos Warriors pre-order DLC. I think a fairly justified one as well, and I'll tell you for why. Total War Warhammer is, in more than one way, a fundamentally different game when compared to the rest of the Total War series. For one thing, and this is the way most relevant to the pre-order DLC, the number of actual playable factions went through the floor. Less so now, after all the DLC and free content updates, but at the time of release there are a grand total of 4 playable races in the base game. The Empire, the Greenskins, the Vampire Counts, and the Dwarves. With so few factions to choose from in the base game, electing to cut out a playable faction for pre-order DLC, especially one which is frankly vital to the setting and indeed the entire late game of the campaign mode, does seem to be a little bit of a dreadful idea. A lot of people were not only understandably angry about the removal of the Chaos Warriors to be used as a pre-order incentive, but were quite annoyed off the bat by the aforementioned small number of playable factions. In the previous games, there had always been a good few more than that. Rome 2 featured 8 playable factions upon release, that number increasing to 14 with later free editions. Shogun 2 started with 9. If you look at this purely based on numbers, it seems like a terrible deal, and frankly a big step down. Personally, I don't think so, and a fair few people agree with me. Yes, there is a much smaller number of factions in the base game, though that number did climb from 4 to 9 with subsequent free content updates, adding Bretonia, made up of 3 separate factions and 2 variant factions, the Bloody Hands variant of the Greenskins and the Von Carsteins variant of the Vampire Counts. The small number of factions never really bothered me, for one simple reason. The differences between each of the factions, or, well, perhaps races is a more accurate term, the difference between them all is a hell of a lot greater than the differences in any other Total War game to this point. In Shogun 2 and Rome 2, and frankly the rest of the series as far as I can tell, every faction ultimately played fairly similarly in battles, the main difference in how they played being stat variations. X faction has a better version of Y unit, etc, etc. In Warhammer, the basic functions of each of the factions are just inherently completely different. You can't, no matter how much you try, force the Greenskins into being a defensive army who rely on small numbers of elite troops. It's just not how they're built. You can't make the Dwarves into a fast-moving hit-and-run force. They have no cavalry and move at a snail's pace. You can't focus on ranged with the Vampire Counts. They have no form of archers, and the closest thing they have to a ranged unit is their spellcasters. But frankly, everyone except for the Dwarves has access to spellcasters, and they're more like kind of iffy artillery more than anything else. Not only do each of the factions play in a fashion entirely alien to each other in battle, but they have fundamentally different styles of play on the campaign map as well. The Empire is a very diplomatic faction, prone to alliances and confederation and expanding their influence via talk and peace rather than just outright war all the time. The Greenskins, almost the exact opposite. They literally have to be fighting constantly or they start hemorrhaging troops as they start to kick the shit out of each other due to sheer boredom. The dwarves are a slow and methodical bunch. Take and hold is their business. The vampire counts, well, they need to spread some evil crap into the ground before they can go anywhere. Otherwise, they lose troops to attrition. But anywhere they corrupt causes any faction other than the undead to lose troops themselves. The other DLC races have their own curiosities as well. The isolationist nature of the Wood Elves and their unique victory condition with developing their little tree house for one. The Warriors of Chaos are a horde faction, functioning as a series of mobile armies that double up as settlements, much like the hordes of Total War Attila, for another. Indeed, the Beastmen are also a lovely little mix of the horde-style Warriors of Chaos and the constant aggression required by the Greenskins. Beyond even just the mechanical differences, there is another fairly large point to consider. In previous games, Shogun 2 especially, and to a lesser extent Rome 2, all of the units were built on an already present framework, a handful of human body types, onto which costume pieces could essentially just be bolted. Shogun 2 went so far as to have essentially every faction, with the exceptions of the Iko-Iki and Otomo DLC clans, using the exact same models for every unit, just with the colour palette swapped. The factions, or again perhaps the more accurate term would be races, in Total War Warhammer, are all entirely separate and unique in terms of their models and art assets, with the slight exception of the Empire and Bretonia, both of whom are predominantly human. Despite the small number of actual factions, to my mind Total War Warhammer offers a hell of a lot more variety in gameplay style and its handful of wildly disparate factions than is offered by the armada of very similar factions that feature in much of the rest of the series. Since we seem to have fairly nicely managed to turn discussing part of the game's controversial DLC practices into talking about the gameplay itself, how about we stick to that thread? This video is supposed to be about the game itself, after all. So, I've already witted on about the impressive amount of differences between each of the playable factions, both mechanically and aesthetically. What can I talk about next? Ah yes, another thing that made a lot of people rather angry. Compared to the Total Wars of years past, Total War Warhammer is a remarkably simplified game, both in the campaign and in the battles themselves. It has been reasonably argued that a big reason for this is the simple fact that this game is going to be drawing in not just the Total War crowd, but also a whole new bunch of people who are a lot less used to the idiosyncrasies of the series. The Warhammer crowd. Along with any random hangers-on who see a fantasy strategy game and decide to give it a whirl. It can also be reasonably argued that a lot of the things that support the complexity within Total War just don't really make sense in Warhammer. Using tech trees as an example, in the other Total War games we start from specific points in history as specific civilizations from history, whose progress, both in culture and in warfare, we can measure. In Warhammer, not so much. Like many fantasy settings, it doesn't really progress or regress socially or technologically. Yes, geography changes, and heroes rise and heroes fall, as do villains, but ultimately, the setting stays the same. For the purposes of this discussion, and for Total War Warhammer itself, actually, we're pretending that Age of Sigmar and the End Times didn't happen. While we're ignoring things, actually, I didn't shoot bombs. Similarly, the diplomacy of the Warhammer setting necessitates a kind of neutering. A lot of the factions will simply always be at war. The dwarves will always be fighting the vampire counts and the greenskins. The humans too will always be fighting the beastmen and the greenskins, probably the vampire counts and definitely the warriors of chaos. Same with the Bretonians. The forces of chaos will always be at war with everything that isn't chaos, and the greenskins will always be at war with everyone, including themselves. There isn't really much call for the same level of diplomacy possible in previous titles. Plus, just by its nature as an entirely fantastical setting, the economy is somewhat thrown out of the window from the get-go, because you can't really account for an economy in a setting where the civilized factions' levels of development and technology are so violently out of whack. The Bretonians live like Dark Ages feudal lords, but with more gold everywhere. The Empire is literally the Holy Roman Empire in the Renaissance period, and the dwarves have helicopters. Stack that next to the fact that most of the factions just don't really have or need economies anyway. Greenskins, they just fight for the sake of it, no need to pay for troops, so their economy is a purely balance-based mechanic thing. Warriors of Chaos, same problem, they fight for glory, the glory of their gods, not for coin. What's more, they don't even have any kind of real infrastructure, and they don't even have towns. Same with the Beastmen. The vampire counts literally just raise armies of mindless undead. How do you make a decently complex economic system that has to account for all of that while still being balanced? I'd argue you can't, but that if you must, you'd likely need to simplify it down and abstract out most of it, which is what Creative Assembly had to do. Some of the changes are less defensible, I do have to admit, and most of those changes do come in the battles themselves. The removal of unit formations is a big one, and it's something that still really baffles me. In Total War games past, depending on which unit you were dealing with, you could have them organise themselves in different ways. The three most common were Loose, Standard, and Wedge. Loose and Standard are fairly self-explanatory. They were toggles, essentially, between standing in close-knit blocks or standing in more spread-out clumps. The effects were fairly simple. Standing close together made the unit fare better against enemy melee and enemy charges. Standing farther apart made them less susceptible to artillery and missile fire. A pair of fairly basic but quite useful functions that simply don't exist in Total War Warhammer. The wedge is a touch more specific. Reserved for cavalry, it would form the unit up into a triangular formation so as to better penetrate into the enemy line. It essentially made charges more effective. This was left out of Total War Warhammer until the Bretonnians were released properly, and even now it is something kept unique to their units. I've yet to find a satisfactory explanation for why exactly it is that the formations were removed. I'll admit a lot of their functionality has been replaced by general, lord, and hero abilities that just add the extra defense or movement speed as an outright percentage increase buff, but it's not quite the same as having to manage your units to change their formations depending on the situation, or activating a unit's charge ability and watching it suddenly lose its shit and barrel down a hill at the enemy. On the campaign side of things, there is the almost universally derided absurdity that is the regional occupation system. Unlike literally every other entry into the Total War series, in which any faction can stake a claim over any settlement, in Total War Warhammer, each faction could only stake claims on specific kinds of settlements. The Empire, Bretonia, and the Vampire Counts could only take settlements from each other, same with the Dwarves and the Greenskins. The Warriors of Chaos and the Beastmen, being Horde factions, couldn't take any settlements at all. Strangest of all was the ability of the Wood Elves, a distinctly isolationist faction whose interests, both in the lore and in the game, encouraged them to remain in their little forest, to claim any settlement on the map. Creative Assembly did defend this bizarre system up to the release of Total War Warhammer, though they did also support the creation of a mod which released alongside the game, allowing every faction which could have settlements to conquer any settlement they damn well pleased. This mod is, if you ask me, vital to playing Total War Warhammer. It does seem like Creative Assembly has learned their lesson on this one, however, seeing as they have announced the regional occupation system's removal in Total War Warhammer 2, and I assume it won't be coming back for the third one. At the end of the day, I have to admit that a lot of the reason that Total War Warhammer is my favourite entry into the Total War series is because it's Warhammer. More than that, because it's fantasy. Sometimes, yes, I am of a mood to fetch my samurai and ashigaru, rally behind a daimyo, and march on Kyoto. Other times I want to call up some lunatic Celts or some stone-faced Roman legionaries and take over the ancient world. But a lot more often than that, I want to round up some likely Reiklander lads to defend the Empire from the forces of chaos in Sigmar's name, or to call up my knights and ride for the honour of the Lady of the Lake, or raise a bloodied axe or three to the blood god, or even just get some boys together and go on a good old-fashioned wah! It might not be the best Total War game. In fact, I'll say it definitely isn't. That's probably still Shogun 2, honestly. But it is the best Warhammer game currently available, and I'll tell you what else, it's my favourite game ever. And let me tell you, I am very bloody excited for Total War Warhammer 2.